All right, friends, we are live with another API review. Today we have, I think, a few blocking issues on the JSON side, which apparently Christoph thinks are the most important APIs ever. And then we have some HTTP stuff, and then whatever else is marked blocking, I guess. But the primary reason that I called this meeting on this day was because of the JSON stuff that Leomi wanted us to finish before lockdown tomorrow. So I would suggest we start with this one just in that order, unless Leomi wants to do it in a different order.
I would say we could do it in this order.
You would or you would not?
Leomi's thinking about it.
No, yes, let's do it. Eric, please go ahead with this one.
Okay. So, Imo, unless there are any objections, could we start with this issue?
Yeah, absolutely. I just
Imo,
okay.
can you hit zoom in like twice?
Okay. So this is an issue requesting adding support for TimeSpan serialization and deserialization for System.HashCode.
Mm-hmm.
If you scroll up a bit, you will see a link to the actual API proposal.
Oh, I see.
So that's it, really. We're not adding any APIs. We're only exposing a TimeSpan converter for the benefit of the source generators. So it is as simple as it seems from the API perspective.
Yeah, there should have been an email. We should have just auto-approved it over email.
So basically, what does it mean for the regular JSON one? So does it mean that the TimeSpan converter is automatically available, or does it still mean I have to manually add it?
So for the classic serializer, that would be we would be adding support out of the box for TimeSpan serialization, which we currently don't do. But this particular API is exposed so that it can be consumed by the source by generated code. If that was the question.
Yeah, basically my question was whether I have to do something to add it, but you're basically saying it's automatically in the JSON serializer options in the converter, right? So I don't have to add it.
Correct.
It just always works. And remind me, do we normally expose the converters? Because you're not proposing to
Yes.
have a JSON converter or a TimeSpan JSON converter type.
Yes, this is how we did the rest of them in the JSON metadata services class. So we already have approved API for like GUID and all the other ones as well.
You know, I didn't mean the property on this type. I meant like, do we not normally expose the type itself? Like, is there normally not a TimeSpan converter type in the converter's namespace or something? Or do I misremember that?
We have just a couple, like the JSON string enum converter, but those are like for the advanced features, to activate advanced features. But the rest of the like primitive converters, we don't expose them directly.
I see. And so how would I normally add or remove them? I can just find them because if I don't have a type to probe for, then how would I guess they're generic, right? So you would do it by that, right?
You could do JsonSerializer options or get converter for a type. That's the public way that we have encouraged in the past. The ones that we're shipping here are for the source generator, so that we don't route more code than we have to for the user's deserialization scenario.
That makes sense. Cool. Then unless somebody has something to add, I think that looks good.
There is a question in the chat actually about backcompat problems.
Cool. I don't see anything in my set window. What's the question on backcompat?
So any backcompat problems with changing the default format? So answering myself, our general approach to types that we don't support by default is they are technically a breaking change in the sense that, for example, if you serialize a value tuple today, it serializes as an empty object. When we add support for value tuple serialization, the empty object will no longer be recognized, but we don't necessarily consider these types of changes as fundamentally breaking, if that makes sense.
So I was reading the thread, and there was an example of nullable TimeSpan being actually serialized into something. So it's not like we're adding support for a new type. And I might be misreading the thread, but it looked like we did produce some output before.
No, I wouldn't think so.
Okay, I might be missing.
Yeah, it's
Okay. So I have a
Well,
response
I
to
believe
that.
it.
So sorry.
that's Steve.
Steve?
Oh, sorry. Basically, if the serializer doesn't know about the type, it treats it as a POCO, meaning it serializes the public properties or fields. In the case of TimeSpan, there are some public properties, but it's not something that you can deserialize directly. So I don't think
that example in the
TimeSpan
chat.
today is usable.
Yeah, that example in the chat shows precisely that. So it's basically dumping all the properties, all the derivative properties that exist in System.TimeSpan. Technically, it would be a breaking change since we're moving away from that representation, but I don't think that should be an issue because we wouldn't be supporting deserialization for that format anyways. So I don't think.
And to the general question of breaking changes like this, if users really needed the old format back, then they could add a converter that did the same thing that was done initially.
So for the source-based generator, like I mean, for the regular serializer, I would normally just remove the JSON converter of time spent from my options if I don't want the new behavior. I mean, of course, we haven't shipped source generation before, but let's pretend we would have done, right? Let's say in .NET Core, 5, we shipped the JSON source generator. So how would I remove the new time spent converter from my source generator? How do I get back the, treat it as a POCO behavior from before?
You can add a custom converter for the type now, and the source generator code will honor that.
So where would I do that? I would put this on the type itself that the generator generates into?
You could put it on the options, like initialize an options instance, and then just add the converter for time span there.
So I thought that when we do, I thought that the options one was not visible to the generator because that's only honored by runtime. Is that not true?
We have a mode that does honor it.
I see.
Even the fastpass mode honors it as well, but it would be slower. But yeah, we honor like all the runtime options.
I think as part of this feature, we should add a little example to say, hey, if this is actually breaking, here's the sample converter that you can add, and here's the one line of code to add it to the options.
Okay.
What format is this using? For time
So good question. We had an interesting debate on that subject because a community member actually provided a PR initially for this, and they actually chose the ISO 8601 duration representation for it. But it turns out that that particular format isn't necessarily compatible with the timespan representation. ISO 8601 duration represents relative. It represents duration relative to a given point, whereas timespan basically counts a absolute number of ticks. So especially on deserialization, it was problematic. So after a bit of deliberation, we ended up on basically just serializing the system.timespan.toString more or less representation, which is unique to .NET, but it's also what Newtonsoft is doing by default. And more importantly, many common JavaScript libraries have now been recognizing this .NET format, and it just works. So we'll be using that format.
But we don't need an option, so there's no need for a public API to say which format I want it in.
No, we're not exposing that option at this point. Obviously, if users want custom formats, the proposed workaround would be to have users author their own custom converters that use whatever format they please.
Can you quickly call out, like, what's the name of the format?
It's known as the dotnet format, but it's basically days, hours, minutes, seconds, or second decimal points.
So Eric, to clarify, is the output of the JsonSerializer for timespans will be identical to one from Neuronsoft?
Correct.
And would this converter also support deserialization?
Correct.
But only for that specific output format, correct? Or is it more flexible?
There's no implementation as of yet, but the assumption is we'll be supporting that format. Obviously, we can discuss flexibility, and we will be consulting the Neuronsoft implementation as well for that.
And so you, when Pavel was talking about backwards compatibility, so previously I would imagine because timestamp was being serialized as a POCO, it probably was deserialized in a similar format as well. So now when we, let's say, only support the serialized format or round tripping, what happens to the behavior of old serialized timespan?
I would need to check, but I'd be surprised if the format we're outputting at the moment is round trippable. Steve might have comment on that, but we're basically treating it as a POCO and dumping all the public properties, and there's a substantial duplication of information there.
Well, based on my own personal experience, I know it's not. So basically, when you deserialize right now, you basically get back timespan 0. So you don't get an error. You just get zeros because we can't deserialize it.
That would be my guess. So from that perspective, I don't think we should be going down the path of supporting this.
Yeah, I mean, I think the interesting case that we just talked about was if the client and the server are different, right? If the server, let's say, is .NET and the client is JavaScript, right? Then you can have a case where the current format is actually being parsed by the client. And so if the server upgrades to .NET 6, then we output a new system. Then the client is only able to parse that, right? If client and server are both .NET, then arguably it's not a breaking change because you just make more things work. But if the client and the server are speaking in different languages, then you might break the other side. But I think that would be in the realm of, like, do we think that's an acceptable breaking change? Because, I mean, I think that's a general problem, right? I think we want to be able to make more types serializable. So if we would hold the line that, we can't do that, then it would be, pretty impossible for us. Now, everything would be an opt-in, basically, right? Which would be extremely ugly for people that, start to serialize. Now they have to say, add converter X, add converter Y, add converter Z, right? That doesn't seem tenable in the long run.
I agree with you. Yeah, makes sense. By the way, just I'm curious, I'm on my phone because Teams has issues. Are you able to hear me fine?
Yep. Actually, you're
pretty
good quality, actually.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
I should be using the phone next time.
Right, so like I posted the comments in. I assume everybody is happy with what I said because nobody was screaming at me yet. All right, then unless there's pushback, I would just approve it as proposed.
For what it's worth, there's another proposal for DateOnly and TimeOnly that is very, very related to this proposal. So it might make sense to do those in one go.
Yep, that works for me. So then let me just... I don't know how to get rid of this pop-up here, it seems. It's very annoying. Oh, here we go. No, it's finally gone. So I guess this one here, right?
Yeah, that's the one.
This is why I don't like when tabs dock into the window title bar.
I guess.
So this proposal is pretty much identical to the previous one, but extending support for the new date-only and time-only types.
Has this package already had to have a ref split between net standard and net formerly core?
No, we don't want to do that.
Did date only and time only go as net standard 2.0?
No, I wouldn't think so.
So this will require that we now have to split the refs across the net standard version and the net 6 version.
Correct. I'm not sure if we're shipping a net 5.0 version in the next release, but we already have a net standard 2.0 build and a net 5.0 build.
I see. It's just the source string converters that will have to be 6.0 only.
I'm just wondering if that showed up in the reference system, because once the reference assembly, assuming that it still ships with the reference assembly, I believe all of Eric St. John's complicated waterfall graphs and things, as long as the ref assembly is united, none of that matters. The moment that the ref assembly splits, now the universe becomes a razor's edge away from imploding.
Yeah, we should definitely take a look at that. I'm not entirely sure I know what the rules are, but I believe this should be relatively straightforward, because in this case the package is the one-to-one with the platform package. So in principle you can even update the platform package with that, with a new version of the NuGet package. But that we need to be careful with, because
well, because this is the case where now if something carries the net standard implementation into a process running on net 6, that now it can have lost this API, and that's when the runtime will crash.
So wouldn't it be possible to make these APIs into extension methods over something like, serializer options? And then you could have the extension methods be distributed across different packages. So there would be date-only converter and time-only converter in, somewhere in the core, and then the portable NuGet package would just have an extension method for TimeSpan.
Or we could source gen it, is the other option. Because if this is only for source generation.
yeah, I assume these ones are not strictly speaking required, right? They're just an optimization so we don't have to maintain the instance ourselves, right?
You mean the converters themselves? Sorry, what do you mean?
So I assume, like, you could just resolve the converter, right? But I think the idea is you don't want to, right? So the idea is that there is a static one that you just know is there, so the source generator can just use that one, rather than having to have some sort of lookup mechanism built into it.
Yeah, that's the idea, that it's statically referenceable for linking scenarios. But I guess we need to check if, one thing is to check if the reference to those types is part of the compilation before trying to fetch it.
This is the kind of catch-22 situation, right? The other option we could do is we could just make date-only and time-only available for net standard 2, and then just have that reference from the NuGet package, in which case you wouldn't have to split the reference assembly. And if that's something that we end up doing anyways, then it seems a bit backwards to, build an extension method system here, because now we, have more moving pieces, it seems. But it kind of depends on whether anybody wants date only or time only. But given that these kind of types are exchangey in nature, I wouldn't be shocked if that eventually needs to be done anyway.
Do you reckon it's feasible for net 6 to ship in standard those two types?
No, they're brand new, right? But we could put them in a new NuGet package that targets net standard too, right? And
Sorry.
and so basically we would oop date only and time only, in which case, you know, you can consume them from net standard.
Yeah, for what it's worth, it looks like this package doesn't currently ship the ref, but I think it builds the ref for unified purposes and doesn't have a split.
Yeah.
Jeremy, do you have a link to the quote unquote rules there, or like the what to consider?
No. Eric St. John is the one who knows the most, unless someone has surpassed him. I remember the risk. So the risk ends up being, so JSON ships inbox, but also as a package. If you get a package library with a higher assembly version, then that will win in library unification as long as the deps file existed. And if you got a version of the library that has less public surface area than something in the framework, or that was referencing the net 6 split of the package, could now have been talking about this type that no longer, or this member that no longer exists. So you'll get a missing member exception, and that kind of thing only happens as soon as you have a TFM split in your public surface area. As long as you don't, then the worst that happens is the performance degrades, because instead of getting net 6 optimized implementations of things using vector and complicated things, you end up getting the slow version using the net standard API. And it's like, well, that's fine. You pulled in this weird library, your performance turned into what that library said to do. But public surface area is where it gets risky for semi-oops. But it shouldn't generally be a problem, because that would require, the problem would be if you did major version roll forward, which I don't remember if we say is completely unsupported or what these days, but that's where the risk comes in. You built something for net 5, you run it on net 6, you had a reference to the version 6 of the package, and now you've carried a downgraded version of the future forward.
Yeah. My question would be to Leomi is so if we were to do what Christoph suggested, which is you, instead of basically resolving them as properties, you could resolve them as a method call, in which case the user could provide them as well. Would we like that more than Eric's suggestion of just emitting them? So you could imagine where you just say, well, if I can find date only and time only, or if date only and time only is being used, but I can't find these properties, could you just emit a helper type that basically emits the entire converter? Or do we think that's bad because now, well, God forbid you want to service those?
So we're emitting the date only and time only types themselves?
Well, you could, so what you could do is the following, right? You could say that the converter itself is public in the platform. So the idea is that if, well, in your case that doesn't help because you are the platform, right? Because you're the entire package is oop, never mind. So yeah, I don't know what to do.
Yeah, I think it's the same problem, because the converters have to reference the types and they're not.
Does it have to be JSON converter of date only and JSON converter of time only? Because if it was just JSON converter, then when you're not on 6.0, you just return null or throw or something. Then you won't have to split then you won't have to split your refs. There's another option.
But even the implementation is based on if checks, which will cause us to root more things than necessary.
The question.
No. You still have the same public API that's on the screen right now. You have that, except for you're dropping what's in the angle brackets. It's public static JSON converter data only.
Yeah, like that.
Public static JSON converter time only converter.
I think the problem is, does it bias much? Because I feel like yeah, basically, if you do that, then you don't have to split in the reference assembly, but you still have to split in the implementation assembly, right? So do you actually?
Oh, that's fine.
Why is that better?
I guess it's not. Well, it's better in the sense that you don't get a missing method exception. I guess it's worse in the sense that if it returns null, then you may crash out for different reasons.
Well, I think the problem is that in terms of like the package complexity, right, you still have the same unification problems because you still have to give the person effectively a 6.0 implementation assembly if they're on 6.0 and a 5.01 when they are 5.0 and so on, right? So I'm not sure that would help us much in terms of.
We already do that though. Like
you already have a different
like Jeremy was right. Like Jeremy was talking about, like when you're on net core, we give you like the SIMD optimized one.
Gotcha.
And when you're on net standard, we just fall back to the slow version.
Yeah, I mean, so doing it as Eric E's suggestion of basically nullable JSON converter, the non-generic form, would, like, we could even make that work in the complicated, you got the net standard version by it tries to do reflection once to load the type. But to then ask for an intrinsic converter implementation or something. But but probably it would all have to have been excised because you can't talk about the type. So, but it would prevent the missing method exception.
Right. In the context of the discussions around wanting to be able to add serialization support for a lot more types, whatever we decide here, are we laying the groundwork for every single time we add serialization for another existing type in the future? We follow the same pattern. It feels like we added surface area, but then we're not able to use it.
The problem is, what does the net standard 2 implementation do?
I get the problem, but we added the generic version for a reason, but now we're saying we can't use it in public surface area because of all these other constraints.
For types that don't exist in the net standard 2.0 type closure.
Correct.
Yeah.
Or the net standard 2.0 TFM type closure.
But that seems to be pretty.
Well,
common,
not very.
Right?
TimeSpan is a closure, but we're still talking about it.
Well, so TimeSpan is part of net standard 2.0, which is why the previous one worked and didn't have these additional questions. So we were able to add that one and say it was not a problem. It's this one is where we hit the new hurdle. There's a bird that your microphone is preferring over you. So I'm interpreting what your question was. I may have missed it.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, I think that from an API standpoint, I think it is unfortunate. I mean, I'm not entirely sure how to solve it. Because, I mean, we either have a story where the source generator can just emit stuff if things are missing. But fundamentally, it still means there needs to be some sort of implementation that the converter can rely on for the source gen, which either means we put the implementation into the user code or we call into the platform code, but that by definition requires public API surface, right? So I'm not entirely sure how we can avoid that. So I think, to me, kind of in terms of API approval, I think this seems fine. I think the general idea that our converter can, or that our serializer can natively support date-only and time-only, given that we just added those types for 6.0, seems completely reasonable. I think, to me, the only thing that gives me pause is the oopness of that. So what I would prefer if Leomi can take this back to the drawing board and say, okay, which of the following 3 options should we do? Should we say that we only serialize types right now that are part of net standard 2? In which case you would say, yep, unless date-only and time-only will be net standard 2, we just don't add those properties. In which case the question becomes, how can we light them up, or do we not light them up at all? And I think for that, the only 2 options I heard was we either source generate them into the user code, or we find a way to expose something in the public API surface that doesn't talk about data-only and time-only. Which you could imagine a generic method that gives you back a JSON converter of T, right? And you literally ask it for a T, but and then the implementation isn't obvious, you know, if type of T equals blah, return, and this way you can basically return you back a generic converter. without having to talk about the type in the API surface?
Yeah, I think it's a good question to go back and think about. And then, the primary, like the existing JsonSerializer behavior doesn't need the API. So users will be unblocked by that, and then SourceGen can come back with its own considerations.
Right.
Yeah, I think for the source generator, unless we try to solve this differently outside of the source generator, it would just cast right to the date only or time only. It would cast the JSON converter base class to the T version when it needs to use it.
Yeah, I mean, roll forward. The fact that the net standard implementation wouldn't have a converter for this makes it like if you get the complicated, you got the net standard on net 6, then you'll still lose the functionality. I don't think that there's a fix for that. Christoph's suggestion of a higher level assembly that adds more of just exposes more of the built-in converters helps a little bit in that it solves the public surface problem, but the runtime problem would still exist.
But I don't understand the runtime problem, because if I'm using net standard 2, I don't have date only or time only, so therefore I don't care how date only
right.
Only or deserialized.
Yeah, so the best concrete example that I'm coming up with, and this is just off of cobwebs of my mind, is you build a net 5 application, so date only and time only don't exist. You do major version roll forward to get net 6, and you had when you built your application, you had a reference to the net 6 version of System.HashCode. The best version for your library doesn't know about date only and time only. Your assembly version, I guess, would actually tie, so we need to skip another version, and there has to be 7. But anyway, let's just say your local copy wins when you do major version roll forward. If anything in the framework or any other library you're talking to already in the shared framework talked about JSON serializing date only or time only, that's going to fail now. They're either going to get null from this converter, or the member doesn't exist, or whatever. So it's not your application directly will break, it's some component your application is dependent on this functionality that's no longer present. Or reference the member and gets a type or member exception.
Okay,
so
but I still
it requires a lot of complicated steps, but it's a thing we've tried avoiding the problem with the semi-ubs before.
Yeah, maybe there's something I just don't understand, how an existing application that didn't have date only suddenly ran into trouble serializing date only, because it's not only the application was not using it, presumably there is no data, flowing around that is date only data.
It'd be like if you're a web application and ASP.NET Core has added some logging that added a date only in their logging, and they're using JSON or the JSON formatter for that, then because you upgraded, the behind the scenes logging has been upgraded, and now that fails because it doesn't know what a date only is in the serializer.
I mean, I think Christoph has a point in the sense that if you look from a source generator standpoint, you can only emit sources for the things that you statically can reference, right? So if you're building against net standard 2, you cannot statically depend on something that is date only or time only, because these types don't exist for net standard 2. So the only case where you could get into a situation where at runtime you want to serialize a type that happens to have a date only, yeah, you may be building against net standard 2, but then the thing you're depending on has a custom asset for net standard 6 that happens to have a property of type date only and time only. But in this case, these converters are not used, right? Because now you fall back to, well, does the JSON options instance have a converter for date only and time only? And the answer would be yes, right?
Right, but if this mythical ASP.NET logging component itself used a source generator, it's going to reference these properties, which are either going to not exist or return null.
Well, I mean, but they would build against the Net 6 version of the JSON implementation, in which case they would give you back valid values, right?
Right. That's why this requires. I think it requires major version roll forward, and if we've decided that we absolutely don't care when that happens, then I don't think we have a problem. There may have been other cases in Eric's data flow diagram, but that's the only one that I remember.
Yeah. So that's kind of the thing where, I'm not sure that that's bad yet, but I mean, I've seen it bad in the past, so that's kind of why I said, like, do we like the complexity? But I mean, in chat, somebody else brought up SQL client, right? So you could imagine SQL client wants to use DateOnly and TimeOnly, and at which point we might actually just end up better off just, making those types available as net standard 2, in which case the whole complexity implodes very quickly, and it's very simple at that point. It's just yet another package. But
yep.
All right, so then how about I just mark this as needs work so that we can just think through the oopness of these things. But I think in general, I think it makes sense. But the reason why I think it needs work is because we have to figure out what to do with the not net standard 2 types, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I recommend syncing up with Eric St. John and seeing if we have the semi-oob concerns written down somewhere so that we can make sure that we best understand them.
Makes sense, thank you.
Okay, let me just override what I had here. All right. Writing raw JSON values when using UTF-8 JSON writer.
So sorry, Emo, can you go back to the timestamp issue? I was reading through your comment, and there was a correction that should be made. You had mentioned that if you don't want the new behavior, then you can manually remove the timestamp from the JSON-Serializer options. JSON-Serializer options are immutable; you can't remove them, and the list of converters is internal. The solution is to add your own custom timestamp converter, not removing anything. You might want to just make sure you fix that. I did it. I asked Leomi and Steve in the chat about this just to confirm.
Okay, what does that mean? Like, if I want basically everything except I don't want to serialize time spans, I have to basically register my own time span converter that does the old behavior?
Yeah, so the way you would want to customize the conversion of time span is to add your own converter. There's no concept of removing converters. Either you get the inbox behavior, or if you want to override that behavior, you add your own.
Interesting. How much work is it to get the old behavior back? Because I mean, do I now have to re-implement the Poco style serializer?
You do, but I don't know if people would, because it's not round tripable, so I'm sure people are already registering their own converters rather than depending on our old stuff.
Right. I mean, it's more like the scenario that I said, where you have like client and server written in different languages, right? So you imagine you have a React Native client, and then your server happens to be .NET, right? And so the client is no longer working, right? Like round tripping only applies when client and server are both .NET, right?
Okay. Yeah, it's a suck to have to write a sample for this, but we can.
Yeah, I would say that it is going to be very rare or very unlikely that someone would want the old behavior. But if somebody does, it should be, we could write the converter for it.
Exactly. So like, I feel like if we have a built-in one that just gives you back the Poco style serializer and it's a one line, I think it's fine. If it's like copy this 400-line sample code into your application, I think we reach the threshold where that's not really a workaround anymore, right? Or not one that we can, with a straight face, recommend to a customer, right?
Right. But we could use customer feedback to drive that decision, right? I don't know if we should do it preemptively.
Well, yes and no, right? Because the problem is for breaking changes, at the time you get the customer feedback, you're kind of screwed if your workaround is wait for the next version. So in that sense, I would say if you break people, you should have a preemptive story that is kind of like add this one line of code or set this one compat switch or something, right? So that when it doesn't have to be like, super convenient, but it should also be something that, if a big customer comes, we can tell them with a straight face, here's the, maybe it's 3 lines of code, right? But like something that is reasonable in complexity.
While we are in preview, can we do some research to figure out if this is actually even something that's worth investigating?
But we run out of previews, right? We have preview 6 right now, right? So like the amount of feedback we are getting and the amount of reaction time we have left is very small. So if this were preview 2 or something, I would agree with you. But I think we are pretty late for these kind of things.
Yeah, I feel like this is going to come in at like 20 lines of code, which feels within the copy paste threshold to me.
Yeah, I kind of agree.
But is that specific for TimeSpan, or is that a generic thing that we could also use for any other type that we add support for later?
It depends on the type.
My thinking was for TimeSpan of just like what's the number of properties it has, so you say to write them out.
Yeah.
Like it seems almost like if we had a generic POCO serializer that you can just register and say, add time, let's say TimeSpan, and then you say new generic POCO serializer, and that I think would be a fine workaround, because then we could say it's always the same no matter of the type, and we write this thing once, and it obviously works, right? But we don't have to do this for this one type. I just think we should think about what that would be, because this is not going to be the last type that ships in the framework that we add serialization support for after we ship.
I agree, and the other thing I'd point out is that it's absolutely possible to build a generic thing because we know the types that we've changed, right? So anytime we change a type so that its behavior is different than before, even if we just need to special case it in the generic one, we can do that, and somebody just needs to plug that in and it'll work.
Right.
So yeah, we'll spend some time thinking about a generic solution for this problem.
I think it's very unlikely people are taking any kind of dependency on it.
Yeah,
I mean, you can round trip, and then the properties are going to be, days, minutes, seconds, expressed as an object. So what people have been doing is implementing their own converter through a couple samples that are floating around. And once we provide the official implementation, they will just probably remove their own converter unless they have saved JSON or something, assuming it doesn't align with what we were doing. Otherwise, they would just remove it if it aligns. So I don't think we have to do anything other than publish a sample that say this is what the old converter did. There's 5 lines of code, 10 lines of code.
I think you should also consider that it may be .NET to .NET, but different versions of .NET.
Right.
Yeah, I think if you add the API of default property converter of T, or whatever, and that just eliminates this debate next time. Of it's like, how hard is it? Well, you just say TimeSpan goes to default property converter of TimeSpan. Done.
Yeah. I mean, like, think of a different scenario, right? Think of something that somebody like Office, right? Office Graph or somebody, they shipped an API. Somewhere in that API, they happen to return a TimeSpan. They never really tested it. They shipped it, right? But it was public for, like, let's say 2 years, right? Is it inconceivable that some of their customers calling their APIs wrote custom code to serialize the TimeSpan back? Absolutely. It's a workaround, right? You call Office APIs, you want to use them, and the way they emitted them was by just POCO serializing the TimeSpan, so you changed your code to handle that. Well, now they happen to upgrade to .NET 6. Well, now the TimeSpan is being serialized as a TimeSpan. Now the custom converter that the customer on the other end wrote stops working, right? And so I think is it very likely? Well, it's not necessarily very likely if you talk about, in normal style, serialization, but if the customer is big enough, it can be bad, right? And then it's really unfortunate the workaround is like, several hundred lines of code. If it's like, this is one type that we ship that always provides you the POCO style serialization, it seems pretty trivial for them to add that if they wanted to, right? So I think that to me, the thing with breaking changes is even if they're unlikely, you want either convince yourself that it's unreasonable for people to do this workaround, or you convince yourself that the workaround is easy enough and repeatable enough that we are okay with that. And I think for serialization, we know that people depend on this stuff, and we know that people upgrade versions independently between client and servers. And so I think we should, because we want to be able to add new support for new types or existing types, I think we would want to have a very easy story to tell people like, yeah, if you happen to depend on the old behavior, here's a one-line thing you can do. Because otherwise, if it's a one-off for every single release, and it's a one-off serializer for every single release that you have to copy and paste into your code, I think that might haunt us eventually.
I actually
looks like it might be a good idea. Sorry, Jeff, go ahead.
I was going to say, the more I think about this, the more I think we should seriously consider not changing the default, not breaking anything here. Because it is going to break somebody, right? Somebody's going to hit this and go, wait a second. Even if it's just as dumb as like somebody may have a date time and they put it in their JSON and they serialized it out and they said, oh, this is how .NET serializes the date time. Great, I can write my Python code on the other side that just, grabs whatever it's formatted as. Somebody's going to hit this and it's going to break them. And it's really, as Emo said, I think part of the question here is how easy is it to fix for the folks who are broken? And we need to make sure that it is easy to fix.
Right.
Second of all, the other question is how many folks are going to be broken? Because if it's not a very small number of people who are broken, then we shouldn't be doing it.
Right.
I'm not convinced it's a very small.
For what it's worth, this has been our standard approach when extending support for new types. Like one example would be async enumerable, which so far has been serialized as an empty JSON object. We changed that, and that would technically be a breaking change if customers depended on async enumerables being serialized as empty objects.
Yeah, just my limited experience so far is that every time we've changed like behavior to be what most people consider correct, like I've never seen somebody come back and say I've broken. Like we did that for key value pair serialization last release. Like I'm not advocating for like making breaking changes, but I think this is correct enough for it not to be a big problem. And some of the other strategies that we've talked about can help.
Yeah, I agree. I haven't had to write code to opt in to the correct, quote unquote, correct behavior. It's broke, in my opinion. I mean, ultimately, what we should have done in version 3 or of .NET Core, which was version 1 of the serializer, we should have said, hey, we don't have time to do TimeSpan. Just throw not supported exception. Or we didn't know what format to serialize it. It's not enough time. But we didn't do that, and we didn't do that with async enumerable, as Eric pointed out. So it's basically you're serializing garbage, right? And if somebody's taking dependency on that garbage, it's a bug, and we're fixing them.
So I think there's a difference between serializing nothing or garbage, which is useless, versus serializing something that is useful, which it seems like what we're doing with TimeSpan today. Even if it's not ideal, it's still usable, right?
Right.
I would push back a little bit on that. I don't think the current serialization of timestamp is very useful at all. I think that's where the concern is. In general, the principle, I agree with you, Jeffrey, that we don't want to break serialization output. But in this case, I think what Leomi and Steve are saying, I don't know if anyone would ever realistically want to take a dependency on that output that we have. It's almost equivalent to throw not support exception.
Well, but if somebody can actually write code that does serialize it correctly, then there's a you can make it work kind of thing, right? So if you literally just output empty, like what we did for async enumerable, in which case, yeah, that's actually the equivalent of throwing in a platform not supported exception, versus in this case we just output it in a shape that we don't like, but it's something I could deserialize back if I wanted to. The question is, like, I think it's okay for us to say the way we ship .NET Core now and the way we approach things, that we do accept this as a fact of life. Somebody is really loud. I don't know who it was, but like somebody was in a truck somewhere. So basically, I think it's okay to say if we given how we ship and given our bar moving forward, this is one of those changes that we just want to be able to make. I think that's reasonable. I think it's okay to say the amount of people that are broken by this we expect to be low. But I think we need to have a story where we can say, okay, if you're affected by this, do this. And yeah, if it's 20 lines of code that we copy and paste, that's fine. I'm just wondering, do we want to be in a world where every single release, when we add a new type, we provide a different set of 30 lines of code? Or are we investing the time once to build this generic converter and say, that's the one you register for whatever new types you were impacted by. And I think that seems to me a scalable proposition. Then we can say, here's the workaround, it's always the same. Here's our bar, and we just want to make more stuff work over time. And if you're impacted by this, well, too bad, but here's what you do.
That makes a lot of sense. Should we then track it with a separate issue of the whole default converter of T type approach? And that would be the action item for this one?
I think that would be good, yeah.
Having the type converter?
I think that's reasonable.
Eric or Naomi, you probably have something you want to add.
No, I just wanted to say that Eric had the API proposal in the chat, which I think would be like the general solution here, because that's the serializer's fallback for all types, just to use the object converter. So if we had an API to create an object converter for any type, then people effectively get back like backward compatible logic.
Yep, that seems reasonable to me. As long as we have a way to do it once and for any type, I think that's great. All right, anything else to add to this, or should we move on to the other one? Okay, then let's go to this. Writing raw JSON values when using UTF JSON writer.
Okay. So there's some scenarios where customers want to write existing raw JSON payloads when writing new payloads with the writer. A few reasons could be to write raw JSON quickly with or without validation, evade our escaping logic when writing with the writer serializer, or to write invalid JSON. So those are some common scenarios. We have a workaround today with JSON documents. So the idea is you parse the payload, and then we have a helper on the JSON element that writes to a writer. This implementation would build a metadata database for navigating the document, which is not necessary given what the desired functionality is and has some perf overhead. Jeremy will know that, can provide more information there. But the goal of the feature is to provide performance APIs to write your raw JSON values, depending on your scenario and how much validation you need. So for API proposal, propose 3 methods taking different data types. So ReadOnlySpan of bytes for the UTF JSON. Optional parameter to say whether you want to skip validation. The default will be false, so we'll validate by default. And this is just, that influences just checking the structural content of the JSON. So things like no 2 double braces in a row, that the nesting level will be the same when you start and stop writing. It's basically just making sure the reader will be able to read it back on deserialization without throwing. So that's the validation we do there. So jumping into some scenarios below, let's scroll a bit down. Unless there are any questions so far. Okay, some scenarios. Should we validate raw payloads for structural correctness? So I'm proposing that we do that by default, just because System.HashCode cares about things being correct or safe, RFC compliant. And then for performance, users might not want to do that because they trust their data, or they trust the data and just want to write it as is. So we'll give you an option to skip it. Should we encode the raw JSON payload according to the writer options? So in summary, like I'm not proposing that we do that now, but can provide an option to do it in the future, primarily because nobody has asked for it, and this is a high performance API request. And if you really care about things being encoded properly or escaped properly, we'll do it beforehand, before calling the API. And another question is, should we reformat the payload according to the writer options? The primary thing that influences that is the write indented. There might be some white space changes if we were to reformat it to align. But again, nobody's really asking for this, and people just want to write the JSON as is, and we can provide functionality to do it in future. So ultimately, like all of these questions depend on the scenario, what the user wants to do. Proposal wants all of these to be fully configurable, but we're only starting out with the limited set of things that people want us to do or have required. So just scrolling a bit down to some concrete scenarios. I have a blob which I think represents JSON content, and I want to envelope. I want to make sure that the envelope and its inner contents remain well formed. So like, consider perhaps the Azure SDK team who write service protocols, and part of the JSON they're writing is internal protocol information, and another part is a nested part of JSON is user provided data. So when they serialize this, they most likely care about the JSON being structurally valid, and the overall payload is valid. From the requests, don't care about encoding or want to reformat the JSON. So our default call to the right value would validate and do nothing else. Just validate that the JSON structurally makes sense, and then just write it to the destination buffer. So I have an example of what that code might look like. So just scrolling down a bit more, Imo. So yeah, the comment just shows the actual API calls. So actually, I think preceding that, you will want to write the property name. I skipped a line there. Right. Oh, okay, I didn't actually. So yeah, so this is what the API calls look like. So that's one scenario. So moving on to the next scenario, I have a deliberate sequence of bytes.
I have a quick question. I have a quick question on the lines that are highlighted. Like, is it expected that the raw value has the colon after the property?
No.
After data?
No, it's not. It's supposed to. It's no. This
the great property name includes the colon.
It includes the colon. So this is just supposed to be a complete JSON value, which can be written as a property value. It can be written as like a root object. It can be written as a enumerable like JSON array element or a dictionary.
Okay, but it can't be partial.
Can't be partial.
I can't do partial things even with the non-validated case.
Yes. Well, with the non-validated case, you can do whatever you like. Which the writer already allows you to write garbage without validation.
So I understand that the colon is written because that's how we have this existing API, right? Property name. But what about the comma after? When I write a property and then raw value, who's responsible for writing the comma before the next property?
The serializer will write the comma, because if you're writing another property after, then like write property name again, the writer knows what state it's in or what state it's assumed to be in based on your validation settings. So the writer handles that.
I see.
So users not expected to write trailing commas, anything, or worry about how it's being composed. Just write a complete JSON document, and the writer will do the rest.
And one more.
So go ahead. Christoph?
Okay. And so if it's a property, I understand you would write the comma, just like you explained. What about if it's items in an array? So I open an array, and then I want to write items as raw values. Do I have to put the commas or not?
No, you don't.
How do you know when one value ended and the other one starts?
We're requiring for you to write just a single JSON element. So the writer knows when you write start array, I'm writing an array of things, and keeps track of where it is. So once you finish writing, with validation, like it will of course know that it's correct. Without validation, it just will write, like if you write another array element and not the end array token, then it will attach a comma in between the element values. I mean the array values.
So, Christoph, I can probably help a little bit answer as well. The next method call is the one that's responsible for adding the comma, depending on the state.
Yeah, I think I now understood something that I was not before aware. the raw value is not really completely raw. It has to represent whole value. For example, I cannot just write partial, like open bracket, some properties of an object, then in some other piece of code, write the end of the object. Basically, when I call write raw value, it has to be syntactically valid JSON value. It cannot be partial JSON value. Yeah, I think that's...
And that's why we're calling it write raw value instead of write raw JSON.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's fine. Like, I think initially my mental model was that it's literally the writer doesn't care what I write. I can, like if I want to write an integer 123 or 123, I initially assumed I can say write row 1, write row 2, write row 3. I can do whatever I want, and then I basically, when I'm done, the writer continues. But that's not the case. It has to be a valid, like in one atomic write, the whole value. I think that's fine.
Okay.
I mean, that's the only way to compose it, right? Because otherwise, the reader would no longer know, or the writer would no longer know in which state this is in, right? You basically, at that point, treat it as a text writer.
Yeah, one interpretation of raw is just you can write whatever you want as long as, and the caller of the write raw value is responsible for making sure that it ends in a consistent place. That could be the semantic.
Right.
But I think this one is good enough, and it's much simpler to reason about what's going on.
I think it's also safer. I think if we go with the, literally raw text, then I think this would be a major hole with people hanging themselves very quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And the second scenario here is just I know specific bytes I want to write, and I know what I'm doing, so I don't need to validate the logic because I want it to be as fast as possible. Like I'm writing some numbers in a different format than what the writer would write, as the example here. So that way you can skip validation. So you just scroll down and then you can see a method call where you pass the skip validation boolean, and so that's what the user's code could look like.
Do we think that people want how often do you have cases where you don't want the property name?
It depends. Yeah, it depends on the blobs, like what they are. I mean, I think there's scenarios where you could want to write the property name and a simple value at the same time, just like we have write number and write string versus write number value and write string value. But again, it's just like we can just add it as required or as needed.
I think there is a scenario, like an array of customer payloads where you don't want property names. And it follows the pattern of every other write method, so it's kind of nice.
Oh, why was the question from Imo whether it's like just values or properties and values? Like values is definitely like I think more important to add upfront versus.
Yeah, I was thinking like if you almost always have code that looks.
You don't, Imo. You don't always have code like that.
Like this,
so
you want to combine it, right? But like if you're basically saying you also need it for arrays and for other things, in which case you need the ability to just dump some raw value into it. I think that's fair.
Mm-hmm. It's just the examples here.
Yeah.
So the question another question I have is, in the GitHub issue, you also have this JSON write raw options. And here we are discussing the Boolean to just turn off the validation. Which API is the current proposal? Do we want the options or we just want the Boolean?
Yeah, I started off So I started off with something that looked like this, where we just a Boolean with the validate, and it's the three core questions, like, do we want to validate, do we want to encode, do we want to run the specified encoder, and do we want to, what's the last one? Or reformat the JSON payload. And I think the answer is, this proposal is saying that those are not, like, the answer to those is validation is the thing that most people like care about, not really wanting to encode values. Like, if they want it, like, encoding has the performance hit, and I think the scenarios are just mostly around, the scenarios we've seen are mostly around just validation. But we can take a look at the proposed API to see what that looks like, and just a question of the relevance, and whether we want to surface those options. We can still provide functionality to support them in the future if they are really required, but it just means adding new overloads to these methods that take additional booleans to say, hey, do we do this or do that? I think that approach is preferred, or is what I'm standing behind more solidly.
The motivation here is performance, right? Like, the reason we're adding this method is because we want faster performance.
Not only. The other thing that we sometimes care about is not messing with customers' input. For example, Cosmos DB, when it stores customers' documents, it doesn't try to reformat them or touch them in any way. Like, the exact formatting that you send it in is the exact formatting you'll get. So this is the other factor for this feature.
Yeah, I think Eric was saying this is the current behavior. And the options, the more complicated options, let you do some level of reformatting, and then it maybe doesn't make sense, because the moment you do reformatting, why do you care about this raw value in the first place?
Yeah, if you do care about those two things, like reformatting or encoding, then you could use the workaround which does that today, and should have similar perf to.
I mean, the only thing I would say to this is the workaround is kind of not very intuitive and a bit ugly. So if we do believe that there are people who kind of have whole JSON, they don't want to kind of, write it by writing JSON, elements one by one, but they do want reformatting. Yes, we have a workaround, but the workaround, as I said, it's not very intuitive. Like, somebody has to read a guide how to do it. Like, it could be a useful feature, but maybe we don't care enough.
It's two lines of code, Christoph.
Yeah, but it's not that it's 2 lines of code. It's that it's not super intuitive. And by the way, how is 2 lines of code? You need to, like, basically parse the payload.
I shared the 2 lines in chat. It's using var doc equals JSON document dot parse doc dot root element dot write to writer.
Yeah,
that's it.
Fine. Yeah, maybe it's 2 lines if you put lots of things in 1 line.
So Levi, how do you feel about the writer being in escape everything that's not Latin mode being passed non-Latin text?
So given the particular scenarios that were being called out for this feature, I spoke with Leomi last week. I didn't think it was all that important, because the big scenarios seem to be take this data and represent it with as much fidelity as you possibly can when you're doing something like enveloping it. I did express concerns both last week and in chat, in our internal chat, that I think it might be a little bit too easy for people to believe that they can turn off validation when they really shouldn't have done so. But escaping, like, yeah, given the scenarios, I don't see people running truly untrusted input through this API.
Fair enough.
And you say that because it takes a read-only span of bytes, so you don't readily have the data available anyways, or?
I say that because, again, just the scenarios that Leomi read to me last week, seem like they wouldn't necessarily benefit from us doing a whole lot of post-processing on the payload. As written in the document here, there are two big scenarios. The easy scenario is like, I literally just have these raw bytes that I want to write on the wire, right? Like you gave me the raw bytes to write on the wire, have at it. Like, you told me to write these bytes, I'm not going to post-process. The other one, and this is, I think, what's important for things like Azure, Cosmos, so on, is I have this object that the user gave me, and I want to put it inside of an envelope, and I want to send that entire envelope along with the inner contents onto some backend somewhere. At that point, we're really talking about like a proper service API. The only thing that to me really matters there is that the inner object is absolutely well-formed JSON on its own. That means RFC compliant, no comments, no trailing commas, well-formed UTF-8, and so on. Which, by the way, the normal UTF-8 JSON reader will not check all of those on your behalf.
Levi, why do you care about the inner object not having comments?
Because if the inner object has comments, it could actually cause an envelope escape. Like when the backend goes to process the entire envelope, because JSON is structured data rather than something like a tag or a tag prefixed value or a length prefixed value, if you have a stray comment marker somewhere in the inner payload, when the backend's going to read it, how do they know when the comment ends? Like, will the comment start escaping parts of the envelope itself? Is the backend now treating user data as the envelope and now misinterpreting things like authentication headers and so on?
I still don't understand, because the backend starts processing the comment. It either understands the comment syntax or it doesn't. And if it doesn't, then it immediately fails. And if it does, then it should know where the comment ends.
How does it know where the comment ends?
Well, what's the comment syntax in JSON?
There isn't one.
Well, but in the extended JSON that supports comments.
So there are two traditional ways to extend JSON with comments. One of them is // which goes until you hit a new line. But yeah. Did this system introduce a new line after where you said write raw object? Another way is to use the /* syntax. Well, did the inner payload have a */ to end it? Like, if neither of those has taken place, the comment's going to extend into whatever part of the envelope occurs after the inner object.
It's similar to a SQL injection attack, right? Where you insert...
Yeah, it's exactly equivalent to a SQL injection.
Interestingly, can't you do the same? Can't you cause the same problems with, not even using comments, just keep closing brackets till you escape the envelope?
Yes, which is why validation needs to be turned on by default if you're doing some type of enveloping mechanism.
Okay, so it's by default it's on, but the caller of this API can turn it off, and when they turn it off, you accept comments, correct? Is that?
Yeah, when you turn it off, basically everything can go through.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. When you turn it off, I think it just goes into a raw bytes mode, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think basically what you are saying is when the validation is on, we don't accept comments. If you want comments, you have to turn it off.
That would be the behavior.
Yeah, the way that I would see this is if you say validation off, like, you are basically signing in blood that is well-formed JSON from the perspective of your backend, and you know how to handle it.
Okay, that makes sense.
And even if you know it's well-formed, you better have hoped and checked that the / at the end of the line ended in a new line and not just into file, which is a legal interpretation of a trailing JSON comment.
Yeah.
But
yeah, when I say in blood, I don't just mean well-formed, I mean trusted. Every single byte of that is trusted.
Indeed.
So the JSON writer doesn't have a configuration for accepting comments, right? That's part of the serializer, right?
No, it has an API. You can write comments directly by calling it.
No, I mean
It doesn't require
there's
configuration.
no writer options, right? So inside this method we wouldn't know whether the caller is okay with comments or not, just based on some ambient configuration state, right?
We wouldn't know that now, but if we added API to do it, then I'm not sure if I don't think it'd be a breaking change to honor that if we because we would have opted in, so we can honor it if we do add something saying like allow on the reader side allow comments.
Hold on, Emo, what is your question again?
Yeah,
Can you
basically my
clarify your
question is more like, if we currently have, let's say, some configuration for the writer that says I'm okay with comments, it would feel odd to say if I leave validation on, that even though I said elsewhere that I'm okay with comments, that this API would now throw. If we don't have that, I think it's okay.
Yeah, but we don't have it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and maybe in that world you strip the comment before you write it in as part of the inner content. Like, I don't know.
You being the caller or you being the implementation of write value?
The implementation of write raw value.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I mean, that one would then be doing particle read, particle write, which would be the reformatting, etc.
Version. Which defeats the purpose, yeah.
Because I think that, yeah, the suggestion is that it just gets, runs the reader or default reader over it, and if it hits no validation errors, then it goes like, great, now blit the bytes. So you'll end up with if you're a pretty printed writer and you get a compact JSON, then yep, you have some compact in the middle, or vice versa. And it's because you said write it raw, so I wrote it raw.
Yeah, and stuff like that, like from my, wearing my security hat, I don't necessarily have a preference one way or another. Like the JSON team will make their own determination as to what the appropriate behavior is there.
So I kind of like this API. I like its simplicity. I am also okay with the alternate design that Leomi had posed, which was for extensibility. If you ever wanted to in the future add a JSON write raw options, which allows us to split apart this validation from validation and encoding and things like that. I did have one concern though around naming of the parameter. Because we have a global JSON writer options called skip validation, and all that does is structural validation and never input validation, we are overloading that term a little bit with a subtle change here to mean skip validation is talking about the actual input parameter itself. So maybe we call this Boolean skip input validation or something like that, because there's actually a subtle difference. The JSON writer options skip validation is only talking about structural validation. So for example, if you do start array followed by an object, that will fail. But in this case, they're talking about, is the JSON value that the user is providing into the parameter a complete single value JSON, and it's well formed. And it's not talking about the state of the writer that's in. So I would imagine most people would want to keep skip validation on the JSON writer options on in debug, so they make sure they understand that their code is written correctly, and then they turn it off in release, and that's what we do in Serializer. But the skip validation Boolean in the write raw value would always remain on because you're talking about runtime input data that might change. So we may want to rename it a little bit differently, the parameter name.
That is actually a good point, yeah, because you're right that the structural checking that normally takes place is to catch coder errors, whereas this is to catch input errors.
Perfectly put, Levi. I agree. Thank you. Exactly.
So what is the suggestion then for the API?
Maybe skip input validation, or I'm open to whatever. People have ideas.
I see.
Seems reasonable.
And last thing I will say from being a conservative side of things, since this is mainly about performance and an escape hatch, maybe we do not make the string and char, just ROS char overloads available preemptively, and we only have the ROS byte ones, unless we see a need for it. Because again, if this main scenario is performance and an escape hatch, why does the customer have a JSON string? I mean, UTF-16 string.
You could imagine, there was a scenario that was posited earlier about doing custom formats for things like datetime. You could imagine that if somebody was inspired to do an interpolated string builder overload or extension method on this, they could go to a temporary ROS char buffer and then and then send that through conversion and then over across the wire.
Okay, that seems reasonable. So I guess the raw char one's there because of that reason, and we want string because sometimes some languages and some platforms don't support ReadOnlySpan, so we just want that for the usability, I suppose.
Well, to be fair, in what I said, the extension method could just do the conversion itself and then call the raws byte overload. So I will
leave that obviously up to the API board. I think from what I understood the scenario to be, we only need the raws byte ones, but I can see some people wanting the other two, and we can add them. Up to you guys.
I guess from a usability perspective, if you really don't care about performance, if you just want to control what's going out on the wire because you're doing your own custom converter, then it might just be more convenient to use strings and take the perf hit. Yeah, I think for the most part, most people don't care, and the raws byte overload is there for people who do care.
Seems reasonable. Yeah, makes sense.
Which you would absolutely care in your scenarios, right?
The raws byte one?
As in, like, if you ever had to call this from within the SDK, like you would call the raws byte overload, correct?
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so the suggestion then is to remove the char and the string one?
No, to keep it.
Okay.
So I think the only suggestion is to rename the parameter to be something like skip input validation, and maybe we just emphasize that in the doc comment that it is very specific of how this is different than the global option.
Yeah.
And also, I think a lot of the heavy lifting over some of the caveats or things that Levi mentioned would probably be very useful in the comments as well as notes or remarks that they look about UTF-8 encoding and some of the things, especially because we especially name it as write raw just so that people know what they're getting into.
Yeah.
And again, for completion, I'll say, sorry, completion I would say, so Leomi, you had an alternate design, which was around using a flags enum. What do people think about that in the future, if we ever need that control, we could add that in the future as an overload. That seems reasonable, correct?
I think so. It shouldn't clash since there's no global configuration on the writer, so.
It wouldn't be able to have a default value, but.
Yep. Which would be the same as this one.
Yeah.
I mean, frankly, we could just just add an overload with more booleans, right? If it's just a very small set, it also seems fine.
Yeah. I think, Leomi, when you and I spoke the other day, didn't you have an idea for like some options struct that you could pass in potentially?
Yeah, I did. But an enum seemed better because it could express the same set of options, and we don't have issues with like value copy semantics with a struct within a struct. So it was not natural. So that struct turned into the flags enum.
Okay, got it.
Based on the subject. Yeah.
So to your point, earlier when you mentioned that we might want one overload that in the future that takes both property name and value, I would imagine that would be called write raw, correct? To follow the pattern of write raw and then write raw or write x and then write x value. Do you think it makes sense to name this write raw JSON value? And similarly, the other one in the future, if you were to add it, would be called write raw JSON, or no?
I mean, that was my kind of the other thing I wanted to talk about is raw the best phrase? Because raw to me kind of implies what Christoph said earlier about like kind of partial text versus if you say write JSON, you kind of imply that it's a self-contained JSON value, right?
And when you skip validation, you might not write JSON.
Right, but the intent is you do, right? You just say don't check me on it. You're still promising you're doing that.
I think one of the reasons why raw exists is because Nuance of JSON called it raw as well. So maybe there's a familiarity aspect or a discoverability aspect. But yeah, I buy your argument.
For what it's worth,
sorry. The raw value does kind of communicate that you could write whatever you want. When you say JSON, it sounds like it needs to be well formed, in my opinion. even with the skip validation.
But it does need to be well formed.
I think that's the thing, right? You're just saying don't check me on it, right? But like if you don't write well-formed JSON, then you don't have correct code, because now we assume it is a complete JSON object. So after you call that, we may actually insert commas and stuff, right? So like you will definitely break your stuff if you don't write a self-contained JSON value.
Well, you can write JSON that's not structured properly, and that can't be deserialized.
For what it's worth, the terminology used for equivalent methods in ASN1 and the CBOR writers is write encoded value.
Yeah, it seems technically correct, but I mean, I like
this is on the fence here. So either write raw value or write JSON value, or maybe even write raw JSON value. All three of them seem fine to me.
I think the problem with, like, I think to me, the reason why write raw value works is because value implies something, right? Like, to me, write raw value kind of implies it cannot be just arbitrary text. But as soon as you do the overload where you say you accept the property name, you would call it write raw, in which case it seems a bit weird. So I actually like the idea of something JSON in it.
Yeah, you know, the reason I kind of missed initially that value means JSON value was that kind of in BCL APIs, we have lots of, you know, things that are called value, and it just means like an, you know, either an object or a value of a value type. And here, it doesn't mean any value. It just means specific JSON value. But I kind of agree that we may be splitting hair, and any of the three options are good enough.
Yeah, I personally don't like JSON in the name since it's a JSON writer, so it kind of feels redundant. Like to have JSON.
Yep, I can buy that.
Doesn't Azure, Christoph, call it data, like JSON data, their type?
Write raw data, something like that.
Azure SDK has a type called JSON data, I believe, that's similar to this.
Yeah, I mean, the reason that value got put in a proposal previously is to indicate that the only correct usage of the API is a thing that is a single legal JSON value using the term value from the JSON spec.
Yeah, I agree, because write data or JSON data, well, open bracket is JSON data, yet you shouldn't be passing open bracket only char or byte to this API.
The only concern I have with leaving the API as is if we were to add that property name overload in the future, what would we call it? If we think we'll never add that, because I don't necessarily we need to, because we already have the right property name, then we don't have to solve that problem, and the name is good as is.
You mean if we let people write literally arbitrary bytes?
No, what I mean is if in the future we decide to have parity with some of the other overloads we have, a write raw API that takes a property name and a value, then the name write raw would be really weird, but that would be consistent with all the other API names we have. And that's probably where we would want to change it. But if we don't think we'll ever add that, which I don't think we will, then this is fine.
So if you add a write like one that also writes the property name, like would you expect validation on the property name, or it should take the same, it should use the same validation option as we're applying here?
It would be the same behavior as all the other overloads that take property name, which is that property name has to be valid.
Yeah, that's usually just saying that for example, we have write string today and we have write string value. Write string implies we also pass the property name. So we use that pattern all over the place. And if we try to apply that pattern here, we would have an API called write raw that would take the property name. But that sounds a little weird, right? That's what you're saying?
Exactly. That's exactly what I'm saying. Yeah. But as long as we don't have that overload, and I don't think we need to, because the scenario can be solved by just having the two methods, write property name and then write raw value, then we don't have to solve that problem. Therefore, the name is good.
Yeah, I can imagine. I don't think it frankly matters, but one method that takes both property name and the value would be probably faster, because to write it you need to extract spans for the buffer, and then it's faster to extract the span once as opposed to two separate calls.
Asan, do you do something similar to what Christoph described in the write string? Like, are there optimizations beyond just not calling a method twice? If you recall, Asan?
Sorry, if the performance would be impactful, is that what you're basically getting at?
Yeah, like, are there optimizations beyond just not two method calls in the write X methods?
I think it would be really hard to make that justification. I think the difference was more important for things like write number, because they're small payloads, and then I measured it was like, I think 5 to 10% improvement. But in this case, because we're writing a whole bunch of string and it's very much we just split the whole binary data. I don't know if that'll be that impactful for us to care.
But
it
why?
Might, but
why do you say maybe the value is just 1 byte representing a digit?
Right. Yeah. So in that case, it might matter. Yeah.
I'm thinking about similar things for like fastpath JSON sortion. So I kind of deferred that for now to measure stuff correctly.
In that case, I mean, in the future, the other option we could have, if we were to add that overload, is break the pattern and say write raw value with property or something like that, or make a different name. Unless some other people, like I said, the three options we have from the naming perspective, I think all three are good. Pick whichever. Yeah.
I mean,
sorry, I got to run. That was all my feedback.
Yeah, I think.
I don't know.
I think in the end, it's an advanced API. So even if the name is not 100% there, it's probably fine.
Hey, Mo, I have a question about the second bullet that you put there. You're saying that even if we set skip input validation to true, we should still be checking that comments are present and we should be stripping them. Is that really something we should be doing? It kind of feels that we have a hierarchy in terms of what is really important, and we should be ignoring.
Sorry, I messed up. Then I wanted to say if it's false, we should enforce the comments are not present.
Oh, okay.
I inverted the logic.
I think we'll just be forcing that they're not trying to reparse or rewrite the data.
Yeah, I think with the term raw in it, if we start touching their data, it kind of becomes a misnomer.
Yeah, I think as soon as people want to have changes affected to the input, then the existing workaround should be like the proposed alternative using JSON document.
Yeah, because if you feed JSON document to JSON reader that allows comments, JSON document won't know how to store them, and when it calls write, actually I don't remember if we called direct copy on the bytes or if we did token by token walk. So I pointlessly rambled.
So does the DOM contain white space and comments? No, right?
I don't remember what we did for write to.
But I think you have the underlying text, right? So you could probably just copy that.
Apparently source ... net is not indexing again.
Yeah.
I mean, honestly, like if you need to have users' inputs truthfully represented, I don't think any of our DOMs in the framework do that. Like neither does XML. Like XML kind of preserves white space a little bit, but For example, if you break up your attributes over multiple lines, it can't represent that, so it's also stripped. And comments are just represented in XML because conveniently they are syntactically constrained to where elements need to be, so you can actually represent them. Versus in only, in JSON, you can put them anywhere you want, right? Before the colon, after the colon. And so it's kind of like C, in which case, unless you do the Roslyn model where you have, full trivia support where anything can be stored anywhere, I think you kind of have to accept that there is loss in fidelity.
The JSON document model writes token by token, so it pretty prints your document and it would strip comments if you gave it a comment supporting reader.
Right, so basically it's lossy, right? In terms of the way the user formatted it is not what you would give me back.
Right, but depending on what your scenario is, like if you want a fully pretty printed document, you can basically do JSON or open it as a JSON document, feed that to a new reader, and that is a way to get a pretty printed commented stripped document.
Right.
It just happens to be that exact logic.
So basically, the limitation is still we could not pretty print a document and give you comments.
Right. Someone would have to write their own reader and writer loop to do that.
Right.
So maybe I missed something. Are we going to use for the implementation that does not skip validation? Are we going to use JSON document or are we going to use JSON reader?
So the implementation that validates, will you use the document? No. We just look through the reader and make sure like it doesn't throw, or maybe catch it, the reader's exception, and then throw something more sensible.
I see.
But yeah, we wouldn't do this workaround because we don't like the performance isn't the best.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to make sure because we were talking like today for user code, we recommend JSON document as a workaround. And I just wanted to make sure that we don't use JSON document internally to implement the validation. Yep.
Right, yeah. All right, seems good to me.
Cool. So then I think, let me just check that I didn't add more notes on the other side. I think I might have. All right. All right, so then I think we have still 18 minutes left, so I'm not sure how far this goes, but it seems we can at least give it a shot. Jeffrey, is that yours or is that somebody else?
This is ours, yes. I'm going to ping Anton because he's the dev on this, but give me 1 second.
Absolutely.
I think he said in the comments that he had to drop.
Yeah, I think so. And that he's letting Jeff represent it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think he said he was back. Well, we'll see if he shows up. Anyway, we are improving the way that we do HTTP2 flow control in this release. And we're still not sure exactly what we're going to implement here, but what we do know is that what we do in 5 is not very good. And so there's 2 options here. Either we do something dynamic where we basically try and detect how large the window should be based on trying to estimate RTT and bandwidth and stuff like that, which is very smart, but also kind of hard to do and maybe overkill. Or we just basically let the user set the window size themselves. So the proposed API here kind of covers both cases. In other words, the default plan basically is to have this dynamic model where in order to make the dynamic model work, we want to expose these two properties. One is just enabling it. Enable, which we've called enable dynamic HTTP2 stream window sizing. The default will be true, but just in case it doesn't work well for some scenarios, we want to enable the user to be able to turn that off. The second property is then just the initial size. So that's what it starts at before the algorithm kicks in and starts dynamically sizing it. The algorithm, by the way, will only ever size it up. It will never size it down. So that's also a minimum. And again, we want that to be configurable so that if you in fact know that you need it's basically, these are basically perf tuning knobs. If we end up not doing the dynamic sizing, then we'll simply remove the dynamic property and leave the initial window size property, except that that will be initial and permanent window size property. So that is the proposal.
I mean, makes sense to me. I mean, the naming seems to be somewhat in line with what you had before. I mean, I assume HTTP2 implies that it only applies to HTTP2, that HTTP1 has no notion of that, right?
Does not apply to HTTP1 for sure. There's something of a similar notion in HTTP3, but we don't believe that you'd want to set it in the same way. In other words, we may need something here for HTTP3 in the future, but we hope not.
Jeff, for the dynamic sizing, other clients expose the ability to turn off whatever their heuristic is?
I don't know.
It just seems a little bit like we're leaving ourselves an escape hatch because we're not sure if we have the right answer, but we don't expect anyone to actually ever set it to false.
We hope that nobody sets it to false, but it is an escape hatch. I will say that like WinSock lets you do this. So WinSock does something similar to what we're proposing here, which is that it has an algorithm for estimating the received window size. And you can go into WinSock and say, turn that off or set it to a particular value. Now, we're not WinSock, so we don't necessarily need to expose the same knobs that they do, but it is kind of an escape hatch.
Yeah, so 2 questions on that regard. One, would it just then make more sense as an app context switch if you don't really expect anyone would do it? And 2, would disable be a better name for the thing to indicate this property is what you like? It's sort of you see the property and you have the question of should I set this or not? And with enable, it sort of feels like, oh, it's off and you kind of want to tell it to turn on, but you're trying to assert that like it's on unless you want to turn it off. Granted, it's a property and you can look at the default value. It's just, as indicating to someone without reading the docs to find out what the default is.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that's better. Anton, you agree?
Yeah, agree with the disable. For app context switch, I think like the big difference is that you cannot set it on per handler basis. And I can imagine that an application, for example, if ever we need to use it or if ever any user has to use it, it can be just in particular cases, like some, I don't know, gRPC, for example, may disable the dynamic window and just set some high stream window size. So I think there is some value to be able to set it per handler basis.
Just to clarify my previous question, is it that we know there are certain niche cases where you would want to disable it, or it's an unknown and we don't have enough experience yet to be confident with our heuristic, and so theoretically maybe someone would want to turn it off?
Well, I did some research on how servers behave with ping flood protection, but like it's not like 100%. We just don't know like if there is any server in the world that kind of violates any best practice, or not necessarily server. It can be middleware components, actually load balancers or whatever that may get into the way for a user.
So, yeah, to explain what Anton's talking about, the other reason here is it's not just an escape hatch in terms of performance. It's also an escape hatch in terms of an issue surrounding how we measure the RTT. So the plan is to measure RTT using HTTP2 pings. However, their servers typically implement some form of ping flood protection. In other words, a denial of service attack via HTTP2 on an HTTP2 server is to just flood it with HTTP2 pings. And so servers typically have some sort of on by default heuristic to say, I think you sent me too many pings in too short a period of time, and I'm going to tell you to fuck off. The research we've done, we believe that the way that we will use ping to measure this should not trigger those, but we can't be 100% certain. And if it did trigger it, you'd be dead, and you wouldn't be able to use HTTP2 at all.
I see.
So my other question that I was thinking of is like, I think what was I think Jeremy suggested to call it disable if the default is enable. You already have enable multiple HTTP2 connections. I assume the default for that is true?
No, the default for that is false.
I see. Well, in that case, it would probably make sense. It just seems odd that you have one enable and one disable, but yeah. I mean,
they have opposing defaults.
True.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, for the I can appreciate that the app context is a global switch of turn off the support, but sort of my feeling, and feel free to disagree, is if we don't know of cases where people need to turn it off, then we don't need the API yet, and they can turn it off globally and then, you know, be upset that it's off and then file the issue that they wish they had it on a per handle basis, and then we add the API. But it's sort of a, maybe we don't want to add an option that we have to support forever if we kind of don't think anyone needs it.
That might make sense. On the other hand, if for any reason we will feel like it has to be an API addition, we cannot add it after release, or cannot, like, we don't backport API changes. So
right, it's just a feature in the next release.
Yeah. See, on the other hand, it's kind of not like it's a must-have if we implement. Like, if there will be a problem with an important use case, then it's a must-have to have a workaround. Probably app context switch is good enough. We really like just don't have the time to do the extensive research. Like, what is the perfect thing to do here? So it's indeed an escape patch. I can accept an argument that it would be better to have it as an app context switch.
Yeah, it's API is forever, and app context switch, you can decide no one asked about this for 2 releases, we're going to delete it, and there's no way to turn this off anymore. And that's really where I'm coming from on that. Don't stick yourself with the thing that you'll regret in a couple of years, if you can avoid it.
So then, conclusion is we don't give you the enable for now, and we leave it as an app context switch.
I'm fine with that. It really is an escape hatch, and so absent evidence that we need the escape hatch, I think that having it as an app context switch seems reasonable. So that brings up the issue of the other property, which
I believe it makes sense in any case.
Yeah, this one seems like a perf tuning thing, right? Where there is not necessarily one correct answer. So having that on a per handler basis seems pretty sensible, right?
Yeah, there might be a use case if like someone really has to disable it, they will also have to change this property, which is kind of looks very dirty in case like the escape patch has to be used. But on the other hand, it makes sense on its own, probably.
we could also change the default if the app context switch disables the dynamic. We could have different defaults based on whether the dynamic sizing is enabled or not. It's a little funky, but it might result in a more smooth user behavior and a smoother, experience.
Yeah. On the other hand, like I had a brief look on how other frameworks implement it, and then they just basically expose these options like Go or Node or whatever. So, but maybe we have a different kind of strategy here. And
what properties do they expose?
For example, stream window size. Or yeah, of course they don't do like dynamic things, so yeah. Probably that's the reason for that.
Makes sense.
All right. Anything else to add, or is that it?
That's it, I think. You happy, Anton?
Yeah, fine with this.
Great.
All right. So we only have 4 minutes left, but given our track record, I don't think we'll be able to do anything useful in that. So I would just say I see you guys probably next week, because I don't think we have another meeting set up for this week.
We're not meeting tomorrow?
Oh, sorry, we meet tomorrow. Never mind. We do meet tomorrow, and I think tomorrow we're talking about not what we have here. I think I need to update the invite. I think I may have missed the week. I think tomorrow the goal was to look at the rate limiting APIs.
Okay.
And then we have 2 blocking issues left. We have the ReadOnlySpan on System.HashCode, and we have the debug assert overloads, which I assume are both easy.
The first one,
the HashCode one is trivial. We could probably do it in the next 3 minutes. The debug one's a longer conversation.
Okay, then let's at least try the HashCode one.
Oh, I'm surprised it was marked blocking. Okay, sure.
I marked it that way just because there have been 2 PRs in the meantime that have come up that could have used it, and I keep having to say add it to do comment, and it's getting annoying.
Yes, that is a very good reason.
All right, Stephen, what is it for?
The HashCode struct has add methods for add of t, basically, where it lets you add in a value. And there are multiple situations where you just want to add in, you've got a ReadOnlySpan and you want to add in a bunch of values. And so this is add of ReadOnlySpan byte to add in a whole bunch of values. Usually you've got something that already has either a byte representation or something that is, like a ReadOnlySpan of uint or ReadOnlySpan of int or byte or whatever. And you can also cast it down to a ReadOnlySpan of byte and pass it in. So that's it.
By the way, the API that we very recently approved, non-cryptographic hash algorithm, has add of read-only span of byte as an instance method already. So this would give us parity with that.
Well, as append, but
sure.
And what's this do? Like, is it for each byte call add on byte? Is it mixing in the length and all the stuff?
I think it should not be constrained to do that because that would limit our ability to optimize it. I think it should basically guarantee that if you give it the same sequence of bytes, it'll always mix in the same data, within that process. But it doesn't guarantee that it's the same as calling add for each byte.
Fair enough.
And why would we not just make it add of t with read-only span of t? Because that would require to do that what you just suggested.
There is an open question as well. There is a difficult question rather as to how do you hash an arbitrary t. What we do right now is we call t.getHashCode, and then for each of those we call add in a loop. If you were to attempt to give us an arbitrary read-only span of t, but often that's not an appropriate behavior. Often, like one of the scenarios that came up here was like I have a float that I want to hash. Well, I can't add float to I can't call add of float because that's going to reduce the entire float down to a 32-bit hash code before it gets mixed in. I guess this would be a better argument for doubles since doubles 64 bits. But if the entire point of this is to try to give you like a hash code with good distribution, really what you want to do is somehow turn the data that you're going to hash into an arbitrary length bit array, and then we can take that bit array and then run it through our sponge algorithm. I'm making all kinds of gesticulation that you can't see. It's great.
And this implementation is probably going to end up doing something complicated with bytes of like adding some zero padding because its implementation assumes it always deals with 32-bit values. I know this because I looked at its code like last week.
Yeah, something like that. Remember, we can always change the implementation under the covers to do whatever we need to do.
That's fair. I mean, so really, I guess my question to Steve, what's the implementation going to do is do we feel that we have a need to document its behavior so that somebody could write equivalent code when this API is not available? But I think we say, but we do intentionally do random seeding, so you can't depend on getting the same answer across processes, or even runs of the same process. So it probably doesn't.
I think we shouldn't document it any more than we do for arbitrary types. It's you give us the same data, we're going to mix in the same state into the hash code, and nothing more, nothing less.
That's fair. I was just thinking of compatibility with existing code, but I think the whole point of this type is it's compatible within one execution, but not necessarily across executions. So
right. Yeah. So what I would do is I would go further and say if you call add with the byte array ABCD, that could give you a different result than calling add with a single element byte array A and a 3-element byte array BCD.
Yes.
Because they are not equivalent calls.
Right.
Yes. Yeah. Fine by me.
I feel like you want to hit enter on your chat, Emo.
Yeah, I was about to look whether I already have it somewhere, but I don't have it anywhere. And now for some reason the thing disappeared again. Because I minimized the window. All right, so then I think that seems fine then. I mean, my only question was if we end up adding the generic one, then it seems unfortunate to have a specialization, but it's probably also not the worst in the world.
Yeah, well, we couldn't really add a generic one in the end after this because now read-only span of T would, well, I guess.
It would just be
special. It would be weird. It would be very weird. But yeah.
I mean, if you call it through a generic one, yes. But we could trivially have the generic one just do a check and then dispatch to the other one, right?
maybe. Again, like if you're calling this over an array of non-bit data, like chances are you needed to perform some other fix-up of that before calling this API. So I don't really know what it would mean to pass like a span of double in here, for instance.
Yeah, so I think it's good. I think we know that there would be potential problems with adding other, let's call them enumerable-ish things in the future, but we can figure them out as we need to. But that sounds like Steve has a plan for this and need for it, so I think it's good.
Okay.
Nope, fix the int back to void. Oh, you didn't fix the int to void. Steve must have done an edit while you had it open. The method is void returning. Steve had a comment of that just being a typo. Looks good to me.
All right, then this is it for today. And then I see you guys tomorrow. I don't have a gavel, so you just have to take my word for it. Here we go.
Been standing by for like 10 minutes now.
All right. Then goodbye, everyone.
Ciao.